Theresa May. The anti-immigration rhetoric that you hear today, she was really the pioneer of that. As Home Secretary, her Home Office deliberately set out to create a hostile environment for anybody who didn't have their visa paperwork in order, like stopping businesses from dealing with anybody who couldn't prove they had the right to be in the UK, and sending vans that had signs on them saying "Go home" through immigrant neighbourhoods, while also making the process of getting a visa harder and more expensive. And that hostility led to over 80 Jamaican people being wrongfully deported, even though the reason they were in the UK to begin with was because the UK government invited Jamaicans to help rebuild the country after World War II. And Theresa May was also a major part of the hostility towards the Human Rights Act. The Tories have been attacking international human rights laws for a long time, the laws that are there to prevent governments from hurting people. The European Convention on Human Rights was drafted in 1950, just a few years after the Holocaust, so you can see why it might have come about. And the Human Rights Act is basically the UK translation of that. And Theresa May was calling for the Human Rights Act to be scrapped in 2011, before Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak even became MPs. So the agendas that these people are pushing, they aren't new. They're scarily old, like the Reform Party, who also want to get rid of the Human Rights Act. But look who's running that party, Richard Tice and Nigel Farage, and their old communications director, Andy Wigmore, said the tactics they use were basically the modern equivalent of the Nazis.
You know, the propaganda machine of the Nazis, for instance, if you take away all the hideous horror and all that kind of stuff, it was very clever. The way they managed to do what they did.
Of course.
And if you in its pure marketing sense, think, oh, okay.
Yeah.
You can see the logic of
absolutely.
They were saying how they presented things, the imagery, everything from that.
Yeah.
Okay. And that is propaganda. Interestingly,
12 steps or whatever it is. Yeah.
I know. And well, you know this.
Yeah.
But I looking at that in hindsight now, being in the sharp end of this campaign, is crikey. This is not new.
No.
And it's using the tools that you've.
And Theresa May helped lay the groundwork for them, just like she did for Boris Johnson and Brexit when she was Prime Minister. Because she was Prime Minister during most of the Brexit negotiations, and you've heard me say before, there was only really one way that any sensible leader could have reacted to the referendum result, and that was to acknowledge that Brexit could be anything from no deal at all with the EU to being like Norway, where you're not in the EU but you still follow the same rules in order to protect trade. And so without any guarantee that the Brexit they ultimately negotiated would be more popular than EU membership, the only way to do Brexit democratically would be to negotiate the deal first and then have a referendum between that negotiated deal and remaining in the EU. Instead, Theresa May negotiated a version of Brexit that was so hated by Brexit voters that UKIP marched against it. Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg both said it was worse than remaining in the EU.
In this arrangement, we can only leave the customs union with the permission of the European Union, which is a worse situation than we're currently in.
This is just about as bad as it could possibly be. Accepting EU rules but are unable to shape them.
And when Parliament voted on it, it suffered the worst defeat in the history of the UK. So it didn't have the support of the 48% who voted against Brexit or the 52% who voted for Brexit. And yet she tried to force it on the country by deliberately running down the clock so that everybody would end up completely exhausted by the topic. Because let's face it, when you hear Brexit, you think, this again? Well, she's the reason why. She hogged the ball for 2 years, refusing to let anybody else have a say. And it's that frustration that paved the way for Boris Johnson to take over by promising to get Brexit done. So may she never know rest or peace.